But you were saying something that I was going to ask about. Just in investing in ourselves and realizing that no one is going to come and save you. And I have conversations with people all the time who say they have that in their neighbor. Like even it could just be like a little league team, or they have this or they have that. But I said, but what you don't realize is that little league team got started by the parents. You know,
Yes.
they took the time out of their day to get the kids together to start these teams and to go around collect money to get the uniforms or whatever else that they needed. It had to start somewhere, and it started from the actual people who lived there, who took the time and invested in themselves in the neighborhood. So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, I grew up in the 60s and I've seen so much change in how families operate. And I just, it just seems like to do the work is almost overwhelming, but you have to start somewhere, you
You
know?
do. You
Yeah,
do indeed. And I will never dismiss, underestimate, or diminish in thought or criticism the impact of racism on our lives every day,
right,
from the day we're born to the day we die.
right. Hmm.
I have lived in this body for almost 60 years. I grew up on the west side of Chicago. I know racism. I've been to American newsrooms and mainstream newsrooms. I know what racism is, what it smells like, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it tastes like. Racism is real.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, there were times when I said to my mom, because she was adamant on me going to church every Sunday, I said, well, Mama, my cousins, they ain't coming today. And she said, well, don't you worry about them. They're not my concern. You are. And so she would not allow me to make excuses. She
Okay.
wouldn't. And she would sometimes say, John, I know it's hard, it's tough, but you got to keep going. And, some of what we face is what, someone said to me many years ago, it's like, welcome to the NFL. You get to the NFL, somebody gonna hit you and knock you down. The question is, do you lay down or do you get up? And, my grandfather, who was a very influential, very predominant figure in my life, was raised by his grandfather, who was born a slave.
Mm,
And my grandfather didn't make excuses. He didn't have a high school education, and he was a letter carrier. He became a pastor. He bought houses and land for his family, and it
wow.
wasn't easy. But they told us, John, don't make excuses, man. They never let me make excuses. At Providence St. Mel, the pledge does not begin, I am poor, so I don't know how I'm gonna make it because the white man got his foot on my neck.
Right,
No, it's at Providence St. Mel, we believe. And ultimately we'll either find a way or we'll make one.
right.
That's what Black folk have been doing since the beginning of time. And so that does not negate that we must have economic and social justice in this country. We deserve it. We built this country. When folks talk about go back where?
Right.
We built this country with our blood, sweat, and tears. This is our country. We are as much American as anybody else. And there's only one indigenous people who can say that this land belongs to them and nobody else. And they've been almost exterminated, you
Yeah.
know. And so we have to, at the same time, when fighting and calling for justice, in the meantime and between time, we
Okay.
got to keep living and we got to come up. What about the Black folk who built universities? What about the Black folk in the South who picked cotton from can't see in the morning to can't see at night? What
Right.
about those folk who had to walk miles in order to go to college and to university? And those folks who looked longingly at the school bus and said pass because they couldn't get on it because they were picking cotton because they had to for their families, but didn't let that stop them. What about Rosa Parks, who sat down on the bus? What about Mamie Till Mobley, whose son was brutalized and murdered? She didn't stop. What about Coretta Scott Look, we have a legacy, a cloud of witnesses of Black folk who keep on keeping on. They can't stop us.
Right.
The only folk that can stop us are us.
Ourselves,
The
exactly.
only folk that can save us are us.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree. And I've been, I talk about that all the time, and people look at you like you got two heads, but it's the truth. You have
Yes,
to, it begins at home. That's very, very
yes,
true. So, I mean,
yes.
wow. So, and, something you mentioned too, that you know what racism looks like, what it smells like, and I mean, your experiences had to be pretty memorable to for lack of a better word, just how you were received in the newsroom as a Black journalist, and as an excellent Black journalist at that. So
Well,
you
it was at times difficult. I should say that, I'm grateful for the experience that I had in journalism. And, I understood early on that I was going to have to work really, really hard. Our mamas tell us, you got to be twice as good.
yeah,
And they wasn't lying. You got to be twice as good just to try and get as far. And, you encounter racism, but there are a couple of things that I carried throughout my career. I was
okay,
at the Chicago Tribune and having a difficult time in my early years, and I went to a fellow a colleague whose name is Ovi Carter, who was the Pulitzer Prize winning photographer, brother. I said, Ovi, how do you deal with this mess, man?
mhm,
He said, you can't argue with excellence. Be excellent.
yes,
So I wrote that down and I put it up in my cubicle. And then another time at the Tribune, I was having difficulty. And I called one of my friends, colleague who was working at another newspaper. His name is Don Terry. I said, Don, same question. How do you deal with this mess, man? They're about to drive me crazy, dude.
okay,
And he said, first four words out of his mouth were, never internalize their disrespect. And
mm,
I wrote those words down. I typed them, I printed them, and I carried them throughout my career. As a matter of fact, in my office at Roosevelt,
okay,
that sign still stands. Never internalize their disrespect, because what happens to Black journalists, what happens to Black professionals, to police officers I have met who had rats put in their lockers
wow, okay,
or were called, names. And, it isn't, what we find is when we have the conversation among our people, it doesn't matter what you do. So many of us have the same kinds of racist horror stories that we've encountered in the world of so-called professionalism in our chosen fields. And I think that when we start having issues, it's when we begin to internalize
okay,
that they think we aren't good enough,
right, yeah,
or the kinds of names that we face, or the kinds of disrespect that we sometimes face. And
yeah,
so I learned to say, look, man, look, that's your problem. That ain't mine. I know who I am. And keep on going. As my grandmother would say, keep on keeping on.
right. You have to know who you are, and don't let what they
Yes,
define you. Wow.
Yep.
yes.
So, Marcella, would you like to ask John something, or talk with him about anything?
I'm just loving the conversation. It's
Mhm.
extremely interesting. I'm just and all the accolades
Oh
that
man,
you got.
I only touched on a little. His background is extensive and very, very, very
Yeah,
impressive.
Delisha was telling me too. So yeah,
Oh yeah, absolutely. So
I'm just
I
glad
think
to be in his
yeah,
presence.
we're very
Well,
fortunate.
I'm glad that you guys would have me on. It's funny. I was telling somebody earlier this week, I would, travel, and I would come back home. And my grandmother, who I love dearly, at one point she was my best friend. God rest her soul. I mean, literally my best friend. I would pray with the church mothers on Tuesday and Friday. I was raised in the Church of God in Christ, good old Pentecostal sanctified church.
Oh,
And those sisters prayed for me. They they just love on you in a way that lasts a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go away, as my journalism career began to take off, and I went to school and get awards and stuff. And I come home and I tell my grandmother, say, "Grandmother, I got this award," and I'd be all excited, and she'd be standing there looking at me like, wait for me to get done, and she'd say, "That's all right, baby. You still love the Lord." So I'm like, "Okay, grandmother, I got it. I got what's really important."
And she's keeping
And
you.
before I
Yeah, you can't leave the Lord out.
no, keep you grounded.
Mhm. Wow.
When you
So
doing
your
background.
grandparents were very important in your life, and
They were really important. They were fixtures. My grandparents were married 65 years. They got married when they were like 15 and 14 years old,
Wow.
and they came from Pulaski, Illinois, down near Cairo, and they just were hardworking folk. My grandmother was a seamstress, and although she was everything, she was seamstress, doctor, lawyer, whatever. But that wasn't. She wasn't formally trained, but she was one of the wisest women and the most beautiful woman I have ever met in my life. And she was just, she believed God. She lived her faith. She didn't act differently at home than she acted at church, or act differently at church than she acted differently at home. But she shouted at home. She
wow.
spoke in tongues at home.
Yeah.
She was never heard her use a curse word. Now, I can't say that about myself. I use some of the adjectives I got from my mama, but but uh, but my grandmother was truly a saint in all of the greatest sense of the word, and they loved us. They loved their grandchildren, and they loved family, and there was nothing that was more important to them. And so um, that foundation was essential for me because one of my lasting memories, my dad, my natural father, left when I was about 4 years old. I have two lasting memories of him. One is I was about 4, and he was being led out of our apartment in handcuffs because my mother had called the police, had the police summoned because she thought he was going to beat her up again. And the next memory I have of my father is I'm 18 and freshman at the University of Illinois Champaign, and I go down to Evergreen, Alabama, because he was killed in a car accident. He was drunk and came out of his mother's driveway. A truck hit him, propelled him from the car, from the windshield. He was killed on impact. So the next memory I have is I'm standing over his casket.
Wow.
So I grew up, my father left us and we were poor. My mother eventually remarried, but the poverty didn't go away. And so I know what it feels like, to feel like no man's son and to have to deal with the pain um, of fatherlessness and what it feels like to be poor and all of those kinds of things. And so, you don't forget that. But, the steadying force for us, for me in my life, one of the steadying factors was, one, my mama loved me and she did everything she could, to help us, even to the extent, as I said earlier, making sacrifices so that I could go to Providence and say no. And I
Right.
mean, they were literal sacrifices. She didn't have stockings and she didn't have a coat in the wintertime.
Oh
And
wow.
it wasn't anything she complained about. I was the oldest son. I took note of it and it broke my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me say, I'm going to do the best I can. Mother has given with the sacrifices it's made. And so the other part of that was my grandparents were our anchor in the storm. They were always there. They were always there.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather taught me what it was like to be a real man, to take care of a family, and to never leave, to stand,
Oh, that makes
no matter how tough it got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't
So
it
he was,
amazing how learned they are, but no school background, but they're very wise and very
yes,
learned.
yes,
mm-hmm.
They
yes.
know
My
everything.
grandfather, it's so funny. He was a jokester too. He was such a fun guy. He died 2 years ago at age of 97.
Wow.
Oh,
And
long time.
one, in the midst of all of this learned, this formal learning, folk in the church were all getting PhDs, And my grandfather stood up in the pulpit one day and he said, "Hey," he said, "everybody getting an education and everybody getting their PhDs. I want y'all to know I got my PhD too." So the whole church is like, what is Pastor Hagler? What is he talking about? I'm like, what is Grandpa talking about? He said, "I got my PhD." And everybody's looking. It's like, "Y'all want to know what my PhD is?" Everybody's like, "Yeah." He said, "A post hole digger." That's about what y'all degrees mean. They don't mean nothing.
Yeah, and
And
you
so,
he's right in a lot of ways.
yeah,
Yep.
folks get educated and don't have common sense.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know I probably have to invite you back to talk about some of the books that you wrote too. Um I know I'm trying to find the one, well, you tell me, is I'm looking at True Vine, a young black man's journey of faith, hope, and clarity. And then
Mhm.
another one, I'm trying to find, I thought I saw one most recently. Um,
It's
that,
called Soul Cry. My most recent book is
that's it.
Soul Cries.
That's the one.
Yes,
The
Yeah.
soul cry.
Yeah.
Soul Cries.
That's the one.
Yep,
Wow.
Soul Cries.
Is
So
that one on Amazon?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it is. They're all on
I was
Amazon.
gonna
Amazon.
say,
Okay.
True Vine is my first book.
is your first one? Okay. But I was gonna say everything is on Amazon.
Yep.
Yeah, I definitely want to read that because um I know it has I know it's gonna be great.
Well,
So
thank you.
yeah, I do. So and I meant to get a hold of it before we actually came on, but I thought, okay, well maybe I have to make that a separate I have to make that
Well,
a separate talk.
I'd be I'd be happy to come back again.
Okay.
But I know I didn't start at the beginning, but what I really I remember just going back a little bit about a lot of those murders, and you said it was
Mhm.
over like 2 decades. Did
Yes.
they even? And I know pretty much of it was because the women, where they assumed that the women, most majority of them were prostitutes. So what made them
Yes.
actually start looking at the fact that it could possibly be a serial killer here in Chicago?
No, in truth, that's an excellent question. In truth, the police were not the ones who identified
Mhm.
uh, these cases as being linked and possibly the work of at least one serial
Yeah, it was
killer.
some sort of
It was actually,
professor.
yeah, it was, I'm sorry?
It was a professor who did an algorithm or something like that.
Yes, Thomas Hargrove for the
Mhm.
Murder Accountability Project.
Okay.
And he was the same guy who identified a serial killer in Gary, Indiana, although the police officials weren't hearing it. And they
Right.
just
Right.
wouldn't return his call. And so essentially, that case, it popped. And it turns out that Gary, Indiana did indeed have a serial killer. And that those cases that the Murder Accountability Project was examining turned out to be those cases that this particular person who was arrested and charged was involved with. And so they looked at all of these stories, and I've talked to Mr. Hargrove, and he said that you know it, it's it's no question in his mind, according to science, what they've looked at, that these murders. Now, maybe there are 2 or 3 serial killers, but the fact is, according to his science, this is the work of at least one serial killer in Chicago. Now, as a longtime crime reporter, one of the things I'm very aware of is that no city official, no mayor, no state, no governor of a state, no head of a municipality, no police chief wants to say that they have a serial killer
Hmm.
on their hands. And because I think for obvious reasons. One is it raises a red flag. It gets people antsy and asking questions. And obviously demanding that there be attention and resources to bring this to an end. And so it is, Chicago still hasn't said that this is the work of
Wow.
at least one serial killer.
Yeah.
And we know that in some years ago, I want to say maybe 1995, there was another person who was arrested in the city of Chicago um, as a serial killer. I think it was he was the Inglewood serial killer.
Oh, we had one over here where I am. I'm in Auburn Gresham.
Okay.
And he would dump the bodies up here at Calumet High School, which is a block and a half from it. And he lived down here on 80, he lived down here on 80, what is it, 84th in Carpenter. I live on 83rd.
Okay.
80, actually, yeah, I lived 8200 block. He lived on 83rd 100 block. And how they got him, there used to be a lot of prostitutes up here on Racine. And he started dumping them in the garbage bins behind Calumet High School. And I think he killed like 4. But I think he was trying to grab some young girl off the street, and they investigated it, and it turns out he had a body in the closet at his home because he stayed with his mother. I think he was in his late 20s, early 30s. But they let him out, and they never even notified the community.
Wow.
But because we had a really good block club over here, they were able to get the information out. And you're right. They don't want to hear uproar, because we wanted to know why didn't the alderman at the time, Alderman Murphy was our alderman over here, and at the time they did not want us to be flooding calls to the alderman's office. So the block club here was very instrumental in making sure that everybody on the block or the surrounding blocks knew what was going on. This
Yes.
right down the street. And
Yes.
nobody ever said anything that these young women were being killed and dumped in the dumpster over there.
Yes.
It was word of mouth how we found out, basically.
Yes. Well, I know the Inglewood strangler. His name was Hubert Geralds, Geralds, and he was 34 in 1997 when he was convicted. And so these cases date from 2001. I'm sorry, they date from 2001, I think, to 2018. The cases that we're looking at.
Okay.
And so he's been in jail that time. But so what my students and I hope to do is we want to write stories about each of the 51 women, and we're calling them portraits of life. And the reason we're doing that is because we, again, don't care how someone may have characterized who they were, or who they thought they were, whatever lifestyle they may have fallen into. We won't get into that. That means nothing to me as a journalist. It means nothing to me as a professor. It means nothing to me as a human being.
Right.
And I've got sisters, I had a mama, a grandmother, and I've got daughters. I've got 2 granddaughters. Enough.
Right.
We have to care. Forget what they're talking about. Absolutely. Whoever they is.
Right.
We've got to show that we care. And in my way, part of my way in caring is by doing what I've done for the last 30 years as a journalist. Cheryl Neely makes the case that when the media comes to these stories and shines the light, it creates a greater sense of urgency. It creates this sense of, knowledge and this light that will not go away, that beckons to political officials and to the powers that be to deal with this. And so it's easy to dismiss it if you say 51 women and you don't know what they look like. Yeah. If you Google the names of these women, you won't find 12 stories featuring these women. You won't find them.
Mm-hmm.
And how is that? That
Right.
they just left this earth in that kind of way, and the person who did that has not been arrested and had to face our legal criminal system of justice.
Right.
It's insane. And so what we hope to do is to tell 51 stories. And my students are also working on a number of other related stories to this. Some of them really, really powerful.
Okay.
And so if we are able to, you know, this whole coronavirus, this world pandemic, has really uh, thrown a wrench in our plan
I know.
because we haven't been able to meet for weeks.
Yeah.
Luckily, as journalists, we can continue to do our job electronically and make phone calls and so on. But I'm going to continue the story after the semester, even if it takes me a couple of years to get it done. But we want to tell the stories of all of these women who've been slain.
I think that's very important. And
I
you
think
said
so
that
too.
you're creating one publication that um would highlight each person and each woman and talk about her life. You know,
Yes.
yeah, that's okay.
So we're going to do that. I'm going to continue for as long as I'm writing my column at the Sun Times, drop some of our pieces in there. But I've also spoken with, I don't know if I can publicly say this, but one of the longest running African American newspapers in the country that has agreed to publish our series in its entirety, and um, which I think will be picked up hopefully around the nation.
Right.
And I think it's important. I offered it to them because I think it's important that our people see this story as well, that
Yes.
we see this story, that we get it.
Yeah.
And if an African American newspaper um, says that this is important, it says something.
Yes.
Long before we were able to be, to get any semblance of just coverage in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and those newspapers, we had we relied on newspapers like the Chicago Defender and others that in their heyday were wonderful um,
Right.
publications
Yeah.
that broke ground and did stories in a way that covered our perspective and that I think shed light on our story in a way that only we can.
Right.
We have to tell our own stories.
Yeah.
I'm a
Yes,
prime believer in that.
definitely. We do.
I definitely believe that, and I pretty much mention that like on every show that that's why I have the podcast because I believe we should tell our own stories. It's
Yes,
very important that we tell our stories from our perspective, as you said
that's right.
earlier. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so we'll see what happens. I say that you know I had applied for a Fulbright scholarship to go and study in Ghana for a year,
Mm.
and I learned this past week that I got it. So I'm supposed to go to Ghana this fall for a year, and so I will carry the story of these women with me, and maybe do a little work while I'm there. But when I get back, I
Okay.
want to pick it up again and continue and get it done.
Okay,
Yeah.
Oh,
great.
Yes.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad somebody's looking into it because it's extremely disturbing. And
Hmm.
being that of a black woman is, we do often, and I'm not going to say just us, but we get pushed aside. It's like we're not important until you make them do it. You know,
Yes.
I think sometimes that's what we have to do. Our strength has to be in making you see me or hear me, even
Yes.
when as I started a long time ago that you're just, it doesn't matter how you dress. And took my 20-some-year-old daughter to tell me, because, I used to tell my son all the time, you know, if you dress this way, the police won't pull you over. And my daughter had to remind me. She's like, Ma, they hung us in suits, so it doesn't matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it doesn't
And our
matter.
Sunday best.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just even having Caucasian friends or being around. I would be the only black and trying to make them feel comfortable with me. And I had to really take an assessment of that, and I stopped. It's about my comfortability now.
That's right. That's right.
Honor. And I had to stop doing that and stop tolerating that's just that little micro racism, you know, what I'm
Yes.
saying, and calling them on it and just like you said, just like you said, being a shadow. No, I want to be an appearance because a lot of
That's
people
right.
are
Right.
oblivious. They're
Yes.
oblivious to us. I mean, wherever we are, they're oblivious to us unless something
Yeah.
happens. You
Right.
know,
Yes.
I had an incident on a plane where I stood up because I wanted to kind of get off early. You know how people stand up on the plane, and my daughter and I were going to a wedding in Florida, and a little Italian guy. First, there was this white woman standing in the aisle, and she was on her phone looking through her bag, her her bags and everything. And then when they got ready to stop, you know how a lot of people just pop up. So I was told my daughter, I was like, you know what, I was feeling kind of like closed in. So I said, I'm gonna get up and so I can get off the plane early. So the guy looked up at me, and I guess he didn't want me standing over him, and he was like, "You need to sit down." I was here first. I said, "Sir, you've been sitting down all this time. You weren't here first." Yes, I was, and you need to sit down. You need to get out of my way. And this, I said, "No, you're going to be a gentleman today. That's what you're." And I wasn't budging. And I'm looking at the white lady still on her phone, standing up all over him, all over other people, looking. And he
Right.
was just quiet because
Yes.
it was me. And I knew at that time, I was like, no. So we got into a shoving match. Then one reached over and was like, you need to do what he tell you to do. I looked at him. I said, sir, if you put your hands on me one more time, you're going to go flying to the back of this plane.
Mm-hmm.
Don't touch
Yeah.
me, ever.
Yeah.
And I wasn't budging. I was like, you're going to be a gentleman today to a black woman. That's what you're going to do.
Right.
Mm.
So now they're looking all wide eyed. I said, yeah, yes, you are. You're going to be a gentleman. So I stopped a long time ago because I had to. We can't take on all the ills of the world, but we do what you said. We have to acknowledge it, and being in a position that we are as 911 dispatchers, we hear so much.
Right.
It
Mm.
gets into your spirit. It gets into your soul.
Yes.
You just
Yes.
sometimes want to jump through the radio. Sometimes
Yeah.
the things that they say and the just disregard. You signed up for this. We didn't sign you up for this. You
Right.
signed up for this. What made you think that you weren't going to come across people of color?
Right.
Right.
Your whole premise is I'm gonna bust the heads over here on the south and the west side, but I'm gonna give respect over here because I don't know if their daddy or their mama is a judge or a lawyer. You know
Right.
what
Mm.
I'm saying? And then you
Mm-hmm.
see all the disrespect that they give to them because to you, to other white folks, police officers, you're just peons. I pay your salary, and we hear that so much. I pay your salary. Well, when did I stop paying taxes? I
Mm.
can't remember. I probably pay more taxes than you. you know.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you're looking into it, and I just hope it causes a firestorm. Um,
I believe definitely that it will.
I hope it causes a firestorm with the city because they
Mhm.
need to be taken to task. They really do. Just to disregard it. Even there was a time I had to stand up for when a lot of the young men were getting killed. What was that, back in 2016?
I have
A
to,
lot
Mm.
of gun violence.
hang on.
You
I have to
know,
tell you
and
that we only have about 4 minutes
Okay.
before we end of this.
but yeah, I hope it causes a firestorm. I really do.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope that it makes some small difference, even if it makes some small difference. One of the things I've come to understand in journalism too is um, that when these people are killed, they lose their ability to speak for themselves.
Absolutely.
And so who will speak for them? And I got a note from somebody today who said, I wrote a piece about how now is not the time to go to church, to insist on going to church, because
I
the
read
churches have become super spreader events. And this guy comes to me and he says, well, now that, since you are the watchman of the city, dude, I'm just a brother with a pen. I ain't no watchman of the city. You the one with the bishop in front of your name and all the EDs and DDs and all that behind your name. I'm just a brother from the West Side. Spare me, man. I'm just trying to make a difference with the pen that God has given me.
That's right.
And so I'm thinking when I wrote that piece, I'm writing it literally as if I'm talking to my sanctified grandmother, explaining to her, grandmother, look, I know you love the Lord and Jesus is still good, but grandmother, the scientists are saying, and God is okay with this, don't y'all go to church right now. Get in your house, put the blood of Jesus on your door, and lock the door, and let the death angel pass. That's why we would pass over.
Right.
My brother, and I know my grandmother would be like, okay, baby, you're right. Praise the Lord.
But see, they used to say the one with the teachers, the ones with the pens have the power. So why can't writers have the power?
Yes. Well, they say the pen is mightier than the sword. I still believe that.
Yeah.
And so I hope during this, whatever we accomplish, my students and I, in doing these stories about these sisters, is ultimately that they get some justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe they will. I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on to the show with me. And
My pleasure.
I hope this is the start of a wonderful relationship forever. Because I'm
All
definitely
right. Well, forever's a long time.
I'm definitely gonna follow and keep up with what you're doing and
Well, thank you.
publish.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, and I'll
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
publications because from what I haven't read it, but I feel like there's going to be something that I need to pass around to a lot of the young men and maybe some who are older too.
Well, thank you very
Okay.
much.
All righty. Okay, so with that, I think I'll go ahead and close. And
All right.
everybody stay safe. We still got to get through this pandemic, so
We'll make it through as long as we stay in the house.
that's
Stay
right.
in the house.
Okay, then.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care.
All right.
All right. Take care. Nice meeting you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.